Atsumu blinked a few times. He couldn't believe what Komori had told him. He left? His eyes filled with tears, his voice cracked. His gaze drifted down. Atsumu had to pull himself together quite a bit. None of this could be true. Atsumu whispered in horror. Ha! Did he care so little about me? Osamu frowned and sighed. I told him to stay away from you. Atsumu's glossy eyes snapped to Osamu's, looking at him in shock. What? You heard it? Osamu turned his head to the side in annoyance. After everything that happened, Sakusa was still the most important person to Atsumu, and it made his brother so mad. He didn't want him to be so dependent on him. He was the one responsible that Atsumu was in hospital. Atsumu looked at his brother in shock, his annoyed look almost making him furious himself. More and more tears welled up in his eyes from anger and sadness. Atsumu felt incredibly sick, a lump spread in his throat. Why did you do that? Atsumu spoke calmly but seriously, his heartbeat quickening with anger. Osamu's gaze snapped to his brother, he too was quite tense. Why? Are you serious, Atsumu? It's because of him that you ended up here in the first place. That's not true, Samu. It's not true? Why else did you get shot? Wasn't it to protect Sakusa? Should I have watched him die? You should have never gotten involved in any of this, Atsumu. Then it wouldn't have come this far. But it all turned out fine in the end. I'm here, alive, right? Osamu's eyes widened, he was even more angry than before. You promised me not to do any dangerous things, and here you were lying in coma for over a year. Fuck, Atsumu, you almost died and you say it all turned out fine? It turned out fine, my ass. Do you have any idea how worried I was? Atsumu looked into his brother's eyes with disappointment and anger. He understood that Osamu was going through a lot because of him, but that didn't justify his actions. Atsumu lowered his gaze again and spoke more quietly. That won't give you the right to cut off the people who are important to me. No matter who they are. If you like them or not, that's none of your business, Samu, cause it's my life. Osamu scoffed, shocked and hurt by Atsumu's words. He was so mad for Atsumu not realizing that Sakusa really wasn't good company for him. Osamu only wanted the best for his brother. He never loved you, Atsumu. Atsumu winced. Suna's, Aiko's, and Komori's eyes snapped to Osamu, all horrified at what he had just said. Atsumu's tears fell silently to the ground, his whole body shaking. Osamu caught his soft spot. All this time Atsumu was so incredibly insecure about Sakusa's feelings towards him. He was pushed away, rejected so many times, yet every time they were close Atsumu thought Sakusa must feel the same way. But he was never sure about his feelings. And this really got to him. Samu, that's enough. Atsumu's gaze slowly moved up to look his brother in the eyes again. He pulled himself together as best he could, but Osamu's words hurt him terribly. How could his own brother say such a thing? How could you possibly know, Samu? If he loved you so much, where has he been all this time, huh? Not once did he show his face in here. Not a single damn time, Atsumu. You're the one to say that, Samu. What? I know my words were harsh back then, okay. I know I wasn't fair, but at least he could have fight about Atsumu. If he cared so much about him, he would have stand up against me. He would have been there for Atsumu no matter what. But you see him here? Because I don't. Everyone remained silent. Osamu had a point. Did Sakusa really care so little about Atsumu that he just let go of him? Not fighting for him once? Atsumu was at a loss for words. He was too weak, too sad, and too upset to argue with Osamu. Instead, his gaze now wandered to Aiko and Komori, who looked at him pained. Can't you guys track down Omi? Komori shook his head in disappointment. I already tried to look for a trace to him almost every day, but you know Kiyo. He wasn't our best man for nothing. If he really doesn't want to be found, then I don't have a chance either. I'm sorry Atsumu. Atsumu looked at the ground disappointedly, the tears wouldn't stop running. He was sad, angry, incredibly hurt, because on the one hand Osamu was right, if Sakusa really loved him, he should have visited him at least once. On the other hand, Atsumu knew Sakusa's past. What would it do to him if Atsumu wouldn't have survived the whole thing? Sakusa would have been broken. Atsumu pushed the covers aside and swung his legs out of bed, tears still running down his face, his vision blurred. He was about to get up when he suddenly felt quite dizzy. Atsumu staggered back into bed, Osamu rushing to his side to support his brother. Atsumu closed his eyes for a moment, put a hand on his forehead, and tried to collect himself. He had to find Sakusa, no matter what. Atsumu, are you crazy? Go back to bed. I have to find him. Just let go of him, he's not worth it. I have to find him. Atsumu. You'll get over him, he hasn't been here for over a year, so let him go. Stop. Atsumu interrupted his brother, he didn't want to hear all that. No one, really no one, had any idea how things were between Atsumu and Sakusa, so why on earth should he let himself be convinced of anything? For you, a year and a half may have passed, for you time was going on, but for me it has stopped. Everything feels like it was yesterday, I can still see it in my mind. The explosion, the fight with Saki, the injuries Omi got because of me. I'm alive because he saved me, Samu. Atsumu's voice cracked. He was trembling, more and more tears making their way down. I can't just turn off my feelings. Even if he doesn't love me, never loved me, I want him to tell it to my face and I want him to see that I'm alive. Atsumu. If we're not meant for each other, then that's a fate I can't change. But I can change something about how we both go through life. He blames himself for everything that happened, he probably thinks I won't wake up, so I have to make that clear. I need to show him that I'm alive so he'll stop blaming himself, and then I deserve an explanation as to why he's not here, whether he ever had feelings for me or not, but as long as I sit here and do nothing. Atsumu sobbed, his whole body shaking and the tears wouldn't stop falling. Osamu looked at his brother with his eyebrows drawn together, agonized at seeing Atsumu in such a state. As long as I sit here and do nothing, we'll both suffer. Atsumu looked into his brother's face, his eyes completely red and puffy from crying. Osamu winced at the sight, it was even worse than back in the cafe. Atsumu put his hands on his thighs, clenching them into fists, trying to somehow calm himself down again. His gaze was fixed on his fists by now, tears still streaming down his cheeks. I have to find him, Samu. I have to. Atsumu's voice cracked again as Osamu pulled him into his arms. He frowned and hugged his twin tightly, rubbing his back to calm him down. Atsumu was crying. He was crying all the misery off his chest. Osamu swallowed, not wanting any of this. He was angry, himself just insanely insecure about whether Atsumu would ever wake up again, and he was saying things out of sheer fear that he shouldn't have said. Osamu rested his chin on Atsumu's shoulder, while the blonde buried his face in Osamu's shoulder and just cried. He was shaking all over, only his sobs could be heard. Not even Osamu managed to calm Atsumu down right now. I'm sorry, Atsumu. Osamu hugged his brother a little tighter, not wanting to let him go. Tears welled up in Osamu's eyes. That was mean and unfair of me, I'm sorry. Osamu ran his hand over Atsumu's back and stroked him gently. Of course Sakusa loved you. I'm sorry I said anything else. Atsumu, I was so pissed at him that I couldn't control myself. You didn't deserve me taking it out on you, I'm sorry. Osamu frowned, his lips quivering. He really didn't want to hurt his brother. Atsumu. Osamu carefully broke away from the hug and then cupped Atsumu face to fix his gaze on his own. Osamu felt really guilty. Let's find him together, okay? More tears streamed down Atsumu face as Osamu spoke the words. Atsumu nodded weakly and then threw himself back into Osamu's arms, burying his head into his brother's chest. Both of them were whispering. Okay. I'm sorry, Atsumu. It's okay. A few weeks have passed since Atsumu woke up. He stayed in hospital for some more tests and to keep an eye on his health. He also had physiotherapy to get his muscles and body used to everyday stress again. Osamu, Suna, Aiko, and Komura came to visit Atsumu every day. Sometimes there were 4 of them, sometimes just 2 or 1. But there was always someone there for Atsumu, and he appreciated that. Atsumu had asked Komura to keep looking for Sakusa and to let him know even if he had the slightest trace of him. No matter what it was, Atsumu would hold on to anything. The urge to see Sakusa kept growing, it was killing him to not have him around. Atsumu and Osamu packed up the rest of the things from Atsumu's room. Today he was finally released from hospital. Dr. Kato checked in on Atsumu one last time before the blonde disappeared. She was beaming, also glad that Atsumu was doing good again. Atsumu, I see you're ready to leave. Doc, it was really nice with you, but it's time for me to go. Dr. Kato grabbed a hold of her heart and pouted playfully. Travelers shouldn't be stopped. You were a great patient, it's a pity that you're leaving, but of course I'm glad that we're finally getting rid of you. Ouch. Dr. Kato and Atsumu laughed. Osamu giggled. Take care, Atsumu. See you. And thanks for everything. Dr. Kato nodded and was about to walk out the door when she paused for a moment and turned around again. Oh, Atsumu. Yeah. Just a minute before I forget, that one man hasn't been around since he came to see you that one time. Does he know you woke up? He looked pretty worn out that night. What man? Oh, unfortunately I don't know his name. But he was tall. Dark curls, 2 moles above the eyebrow. Atsumu's eyes widened, his heart raced. He felt an uneasy feeling in the area of his stomach, he was trembling. Atsumu looked at Osamu, who was looking first at Dr. Kato and now at Atsumu, also shocked. Could it be Sakusa? Atsumu nodded, turning back to Dr. Kato. When was that, Doc? The day you woke up. He was in your room only minutes before. I'm sorry, with all the stress here, I didn't think to tell you earlier. Atsumu's whole body was shaking, he had to sit down. Hey Atsumu. Are you alright? Osamu and Dr. Kato rushed to him and checked on him. Atsumu's look was full of horror and panic. His heart was beating increasingly hard and fast, almost to the point of hurting. Atsumu whispered, his gaze staring holes in the air. He was here, Samu. Atsumu's eyes met his brother's. Osamu turned to Dr. Kato and spoke quietly to her. Do you know where he was heading to? Dr. Kato shook her head. No, I'm sorry. He just said he was leaving town. Okay, alright. Thank you, Dr. Kato, for everything. I think Atsumu and I better go home now. Can you contact us if he ever returns? Of course. Thank you, Dr. Kato. Dr. Kato frowned, nodded to Osamu and left the room. Atsumu was still shaking, tears welling up in his eyes. Osamu squatted down to Atsumu and rubbed his hands over Atsumu's arms to soothe the twin. Atsumu looked at his brother, startled. Hey, are you okay? Atsumu slapped his palms to his face and leaned forward, his forehead now resting on Osamu's shoulder. He was here when I woke up. Osamu pulled Atsumu into a hug, the shaking slowly easing. We'll find him, Atsumu. A few more weeks passed since Atsumu was released from the hospital. He went back to live with Aiko and Komura, who helped him find Sakusa, as they had been looking for him for some time. In the meantime, Atsumu traveled a lot through the country, always hoping to meet Sakusa somewhere, unfortunately in vain. He visited Yachi and Kuru, who had moved in together by now, and spent a few days with them. Then he traveled on, out into nature, to clear his head, to search for Sakusa. But no matter where he went, it was all for nothing. Sakusa had disappeared from the face of the earth. It was already evening when Atsumu returned home from another short trip. He unpacked his stuff and freshened up. As he finished, he wanted to go to the living room to Aiko and Komori, when he suddenly passed Sakusa's room. All this time he never dared to set a foot in there. He was afraid of what it would do to him, since Sakusa left almost everything behind. Atsumu put his hand on the door handle and slowly opened the door. What he found there was an impeccably cleaned room. Sakusa's bed was in the middle of it. Atsumu smiled as he remembered how he had always helped Sakusa fall asleep during his night shift. How much time they spent here. How close they had become in this place. Atsumu walked into Sakusa's room and closed the door behind him. He walked to the closet and gently stroked Sakusa's clothes, then took out a large black sweater from it. Atsumu looked at the piece of clothing. It was the same sweater Sakusa wore back when they first fought because of the knockout drops incident. When Sakusa almost beat up Atsumu. When Sakusa had finally opened up to Atsumu for the first time. Suddenly, it snapped to Atsumu's mind. He had been looking everywhere for Sakusa, traveling all over the country when there was a place he hadn't looked yet. Atsumu held the sweater tightly in his grip as he hurried out the door. He hastily put on his shoes and slipped the sweater on. Aiko peeked into the hallway and saw Atsumu in a hurry. "Atsumu, where are you going?" "There's a place I haven't looked yet, Aiko." Aiko looked at Atsumu in confusion. "I'll just be outside for a minute." "Atsumu, don't worry, it won't be long, but I have to go there right now." "Where? Do you want me to come with you?" Atsumu shook his head vigorously. "No, Aiko, I have to check it out on my own." It was the place that only Sakusa and he knew about. "Okay, but please be careful. Do you have your phone with you?" Aiko looked at Atsumu worriedly. On the one hand, she was afraid that he was getting too carried away, and on the other hand, she was just worried because dawn had already set in and she didn't know what Atsumu was up to. Atsumu reached for his phone and showed it to Aiko in a shaking motion. "I am available. See you later, okay?" "Okay." Aiko nodded and watched the blonde boy sprint out the door. She frowned and hummed, eyebrows drawn tightly together. Suddenly, she snapped her eyes open and looked a little frozen. Wasn't that Kiyoomi's sweater? Atsumu ran as fast as he could. It was indeed getting darker, but the last rays of sunlight lit him the way. He ran and was completely out of breath. There was this one chance to which he was clinging. But how much of a chance was it? Hadn't Dr. Kato mentioned that Sakusa had left town? So why would he be here? Atsumu finally arrived where his legs took him. There it was, in front of him, the old, large ruin in the secluded patch of woods that only Sakusa and he knew about. Atsumu looked up, his heart beating faster and faster. He struggled his way up. Since he had been in hospital for so long, he had physically degraded quite a bit and was nowhere near as strong as he used to be. But Atsumu wanted to get up there at all costs, because his whole hope was to meet Sakusa up there. So he climbed on and on until he was at the limit of his strength and beyond. He pulled himself up with all his might, gasping for air as he reached the top. He rested his arms on his thighs and tried to breathe deeply. His body was really not used to this anymore. Atsumu looked around, his eyes were wider than ever, but he saw no one. Atsumu was all alone, no one was there but him. He stumbled to the edge wall, the images of him and Sakusa flashing through his mind. A tear rolled down Atsumu's cheek as he realized that all his hope had been shattered. What was he expecting? To actually find Sakusa here? Atsumu heaved himself up onto the wall and swung his legs over it, letting them now tumble freely in the air as he gazed out at the city. The sun almost completely set. One tear after the other rolled down his face. Atsumu really didn't know what to do anymore. "Omi, where are you?" Atsumu pulled up the hood of Sakusa's sweater and brought his legs close to his body. He bent them and clasped them, resting his chin on his knees and gazing into the distance. Atsumu made himself very small, letting the tears continue to fall. What would he give to see Sakusa one more time? To embrace him once more, to feel his closeness, his warmth. His heart ached. He felt as if someone had drilled a hole in it and no one was able to close it again. No one except Sakusa. Atsumu sobbed, burying his head in his arms now, in his knees, more and more tears flowing down the blonde's cheeks. Were he and Sakusa just not made for each other? Was the whole thing their fate? Fate. "Hey, are you okay?" Atsumu winced. He lifted his head and widened his eyes. That voice. Atsumu snapped his head, his whole body in the direction from which the voice came, and spotted a tall figure with black, dark curls. Dusk had already set in, but it was still bright enough to make out the figure in front of him. Atsumu was sure of it now. "Omi." His voice cracked. More tears streamed down his face. It was true, after all this time, it was Sakusa standing in front of him, looking at him perplexed as well. Sakusa was shaking all over, his eyes wide open. "𝒖𝒔𝒊𝒄." They faced each other, both stunned to see the other one. It had been almost 2 years since they had last seen each other. How much had changed between them since then?